Next one you cause to pass out, we're calling this off.
Well, you know, funny. Oh, thank you.
I guess it wasn't, but.
No, last week I had a coughing fit when I was trying to work with the planning commission. So I said, what is it about this ordinance? You know? They were getting ready to call an ambulance for me last week.
All right, I apologize to the public for the delay, but not but so much. We basically had a medical emergency, and we've taken care of that, and wish that patient well without getting into too much detail right now. So, okay, and Debbie, if you can remember where we were before we did that?
Yes, sir. I believe we were talking about the need for a conditional use permit for what the Planning Commission had identified as larger scale commercial activities. Remember, I had indicated that the threshold for requiring a conditional use permit for commercial uses measuring more than 15,000 square feet. And I think...
Yeah, I basically just asked that we just compare against the ordinances and use a similar number.
Okay.
If there's a similar number in our other ordinances, I don't want to degrade that number.
Was it 25,000 was the other number?
We don't have...
If you don't.
Yeah, I misspoke.
Okay, so you don't have a number.
No, sir.
So a business the size of Rite Aid, I think you said was 12,000. Okay, and 15,000 just seems small. What I don't want, here's the reasoning behind my concern on this point. What I don't want is for a developer who has to negotiate multiple parties. Let's say that he's negotiating with some homes. He's going to do a PUD. He's also got a buyer, you know, that he's working with. That the square footage is too small for him to have to come to council in the middle of negotiations and say, well, can I do this if it's 20,000 square feet? You know, or it's basically not even a traffic generator. Let's say it's a manufacturer who says, I want to build a factory that builds, you know, batteries. Okay, and he comes in and says, you know, as part of his planned unit development, the manufacturing facility for this would be, you know, 50,000 square feet. I just want to make sure it's dedicated to high traffic volumes greater than a certain square footage is kind of what I would like to see. I got the high traffic volume. I understand that way of thinking. I just don't want to treat every business the same. It's not a McDonald's. It's not, you know, it's, I'm thinking high traffic seems to have more to do with it than square footage is what I'm really thinking.
Well, Eugene, I started this line of questioning, and my thought process was similar but different. And what I don't want to do, the original comment was it wasn't changing the zoning criteria for the zones that encompassed within that district, okay? And I don't want to encumber new businesses, and we're working hard to develop new commercial business in the city and to work into those areas, and I don't want to encumber the processes for business to come to do that.
Right. I think we're all on the same page here. So just, and you'll probably hear some conversation of that up there. Maybe we can talk for a few minutes between meetings or whatever, but
Okay.
That's the only thing I'm concerned about.
That's a good point. Very good point. When the Planning Commission was developing the district regulations, they tried to maintain, I don't want to say a relaxation, but they tried to make the design criteria as flexible as possible. However, there are some design criteria that they feel is needed. So the next two slides basically outlines the design criteria that's incorporated as a requirement in the ordinance, and then the next slide is more of a flexible list of items that the developer will actually address on a case-by-case basis with the City Council during the public hearing process. But with that said, please keep in mind that in order to activate the use of the overlay district on a piece of property or within a developable area, that developable area must measure a minimum of 5 acres. The Planning Commission is recommending that we require a 20% open space or green space within the development, and that, of course, can include non-tidal wetlands. A 40-foot perimeter buffer is also recommended, but please keep in mind that that 40-foot buffer could be eliminated if the proposed development is going to lie adjacent to an area that could also be used for the same type of concept in the future. So basically, the 40-foot buffer could be waived by City Council if it's going to lie adjacent to other land located in the Big Woods. And of course, there is also a provision in the ordinance that allows for automatic expansion of the existing provisions, of the existing boundaries of the PUD if it's considered a logical expansion in the, on the land use map. The other maximum number that's a real key component in this ordinance is the fact that Planning Commission is recommending that you recognize the residential density yield requirements or guidance that's offered in the comprehensive plan, which is 12 units per acre. So under no circumstances, even though with each application you would consider the density, the residential density yield on a case-by-case basis, at no point should it exceed 12 units per acre. Front yard setbacks.
I'm sorry, let me, because in the other presentation it had like a sliding scale. Is that still what's in the ordinance?
I'm going to get to that in my next.
I'm
That's
sorry.
under the flexible.
You just tell me to sit here quietly and
No,
you keep breathing.
it's
You
good
keep telling me.
points. You're keeping me on track. That's good. I appreciate it. Front yard setbacks, the only actual setbacks that are recommended are for the residential areas and only for the front yard. The balance of it would be for you guys to decide at the application approval process, whether or not you want building separation, side yards, and things of that nature. But we are recommending that in the residential area, that you maintain either a 10-foot or a 15-foot setback from either a public or a private street. The purpose of that is to give some building separation from the street to allow for some streetscape, some landscaping, and a pedestrian path. Please keep in mind that this ordinance is strongly recommending that you encourage a pedestrian-friendly environment. So without the sidewalks or the pedestrian paths, you're going to be discouraging that type of environment. And finally, on this slide, and it's a very important feature, it's the construction sequencing. Construction sequencing basically refers to the amount, the ratio between what you're going to allow for a residential area as opposed to the commercial. And the Planning Commission really worked very hard on this ratio, and it's a very hard number to come up with, but they ultimately are recommending that there be no more than 75% of occupancy of the residential component of the overlay district without commercial infrastructure being installed. It does not mean that you're going to have to build a building that's going to sit vacant. It does not mean that you have to make any improvements on the property in hopes that that's going to work for a future developer. But what it does mean is that the infrastructure, such as your utilities and your drainage, need to be addressed at the master plan approval stage. And they have to be installed before 70% occupancy of the residential area. Any questions with that?
The drainage structures, the parking lots, the things like that is what you're talking about?
Not parking lots.
Okay.
We're not recommending any improvements
Okay.
either for the building and or the supporting facilities until there's a buyer or occupant of that commercial activity.
Okay.
Excuse me.
But Debbie, how far are you trying to carry that? In other words, the size of the commercial unit could determine what size meter you have and what size pipe serves that water meter. and it could determine the size of the sewer. So, well, I mean, what do you determine as a stub out? Something actually to the property line of that commercial building?
Yes.
I mean, that may be hard for them to figure out what it's gonna be.
Well, most likely, and Bob would probably be a good one to answer, but most likely the pipe size for the sewer is going to be large enough that it's going to accommodate, the entire area. Now, the individual meter sizes for both the water and the sewer, that would be determined at the site development stage once construction occurs. They would not have to install those improvements at the master plan stage.
Okay.
The purpose of this is to basically, one, we don't want to create vacant shells which could cause blight in the community. Secondly, we hate for a developer to go in and start putting in improvements such as sidewalks and parking lots and a building pad. Why disturb that area of woodland until it's absolutely necessary? However, the developer has an obligation to prove to the council and to safeguard the community against coming in and putting in vast areas of residential without providing supporting commercial activities.
Agreed. It sounds to me like you and the Planning Commission have put a tremendous amount of time into the thought process of it is about both. It's about residential, it's about business. You've made the allowance that the developer can have the extra time to shop that user. And all you're asking for is the utilities and the key attributes are in the plan.
Correct.
For him to go above 75%.
Correct.
And we're not going to end up with a bunch of vacant buildings standing there waiting for somebody who the building may or may not fit. So it's really what you're kind of saying is pad ready development.
Without the improvements on the individual pad, yes.
Okay.
Yep. One other.
You have a question?
I'm curious whether we have a letter from somebody in the public, and it says that they didn't recommend the no more than 75%, what we were proposing, and they proposed instead, rather than mandating the vertical commercial construction ahead of the market, that the developer instead be required to provide development-ready commercial sites sufficient to support the amount of commercial space. Are they saying that they would have already, and it was a lot of it was about financing, that a developer may not be able to get financing until there's people there to use the business that they're proposing to build. How are we bridging that? I'm wondering whether he is already saying what we're saying.
I think what I heard you read, he's saying the same thing. If you can read that one more time.
And that's exactly what it is. Basically, these people were, the letter that you received are individuals that have been working with the Planning Commission or are attending Planning Commission meetings.
Okay.
And is fairly well-versed on what their thought process is.
So the comment that they made has been incorporated into the...
I believe so,
Okay,
yes.
that's what I thought it had, I just was making sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
One other design criteria here that is a requirement that I failed to mention when I was talking about front yards, and that is along Victory Boulevard. We are recommending that the 40-foot front yard setback that's imposed for the underlying zoning district along Victory Boulevard today be maintained through this overlay district process. And that's just in an effort to preserve the overall character of the city as you enter in off of Victory. Okay, one more slide and then I'll be through. Finally, there's some flexible design criteria in here, and it's premised in the ordinance constantly with, this is to be considered on a case-by-case basis. You see that language throughout. And like I said, the design criteria that's required is exactly what I just outlined on the preceding slide. But there are some interesting flexibility items in this ordinance, and I guess let's start with the most difficult. And that's the inclusion of non-tidal wetlands in the calculation of creating your residential density yield, okay? Meaning that there's a lot of pockets of non-tidal wetland landowners in the city or in this Big Woods area. What this ordinance or what this provision will allow is for the incorporation of those lands which may otherwise have absolutely no value. It allows for them to participate in the unified development concept. With that said, when we first introduced it to the Planning Commission, we just threw a number out there, staff did. And so that number was you could yield up to 12 residential units, and you could use up to 50% of the non-tidal wetland areas to calculate the yield for those units. However, when the Planning Commission started evaluating the flexibility provision and wanting to really assist those landowners with these large areas of non-tidal wetlands, what they ultimately decided was to create a sliding scale. So you start out with allowing a 50% credit for your non-tidal wetland areas for a 12-unit density yield. However, if you want to increase the amount of wetlands that you use, you may do so up to 100%. However, for every 10% of wetland credit that you receive over the 50%, your residential density yield is reduced by 1. So you go from allowing a 50% credit of non-tidal wetlands for a 12-unit yield on your residential, but if you decide that you want to scale that up to 100%, then your maximum density yield for residential in this area would be 7. So you're reducing your density yield for every 10% of additional credit that you get for the use of the non-tidal wetlands. That should tremendously help these landowners with these pockets of wetlands that might be right in the area of an area that a developer would need to try to gain the access for the development itself, for the upland areas. But with that said, that is the most critical, flexible design criteria that's in this ordinance, or specifically on this slide.
That's really, in my opinion, we've chatted a lot along the ways, but that's, what y'all came up with there is incredibly brilliant. I'm going to tell you, because what you're saying is that you can't build 12 units per acre and get credit for the wetlands, or you can build 12 units per acre and only get half credit for your wetlands. But if you're really trying to control density by saying it's a this many unit match in exchange for wetlands.
Correct.
And I would like to see us do that in many of our ordinances, so that wetlands become a valuable piece of Poquoson again, instead of they're devalued by wetlands folks. So.
And the luxury, too, is that these areas, if the wetlands are used for credit, then they have to be preserved, which helps us with our stormwater regulations with the state. So for the more area that we preserve of non-tidal and woody areas, then that's going to help us trying to meet our stormwater calculation requirements. So.
Debbie, one question on that area. If for instance, in the process of developing the area, you had a non-tidal wetland in the middle of the development, can we trade that piece of wetland for another piece of maybe non-wetland within the same area and get the same credit? You know what I mean?
Okay, there are some limitations with this credit. Okay, number one, it has to be within the same development.
Okay, that's what
Okay.
I'm talking about.
And if there's going to be any trading off, please keep in mind that that requires an impact to the wetland, which has to be approved at the federal level. So I would assume that if there is a trade-off and it occurs within the same developable area, and of course, they acquire all the necessary permits, then there's a potential that that could occur. But that is something that would have to be reviewed by City Council at the master plan approval process.
But going back to the ratio, so what you've given them is the ability to use another measure to offset that. So what I'm seeing that we've done is we've given, if that piece is in your way, you may be able to build 2 over here instead of none or 1 over there. You've given them a tool, probably better than any tool that we've ever given, that says wetlands are in the equation.
I was just hoping that, like, if right in the middle of what you wanted to do, okay, there was a piece of non-tidal wetland, that you might be able to fill that in and make it contiguous throughout that area and pay for another piece in an area that's not accessible.
And if in the worst case in the federal, because we always hear the rumors of what federal government allows, if they made you do a 2-to-1 trade and you lost another acre of wetlands, then you would use another one of the density calculations to offset that with an additional usable lot. In other words, you might increase your overall density. That's why I said I think that the sliding scale, we may not have gotten it all exactly right, but it's really, really good thinking.
Pretty good, fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the way I see it, you could do the same thing he's talking about, you just include another property in your development.
That's right.
Use it and build your development.
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Okay.
That basically concludes the presentation. The balance of the flexibility is in the landscaping, your street designs, things of that nature that will be addressed at the master plan review and approval stage. So I'm sorry it's taken a little longer than what I expected.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry that we had to move along so quickly after we got held up. Does anybody on council have any questions?
Oh, yes.
Any concerns or?
You've done a lot of good work. Thank you.
Thank you for the hard work on this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, then we'll adjourn the work session and move on to the regular meeting.